1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. You guys should hear me now. Okay, good. I can hear myself. Yay. Okay, so get that stopped and get that stopped. So that's going there. Okay, beautiful. Let me do one more thing here. Okay. Ta-da! Hello, everyone. Nice to see you again. Okay, so hope your feast was good, and hope everything went okay for you. And if you guys camped out, I hope it wasn't raining. We're in the middle of tropical storms down here. So, hey, Alan. Hey, Wes and Cindy and Jean and everybody else, Jeannie. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Bereshit. And I told a joke about bears in the woods, and it went over like a brick. It was in the middle of a summer camp thing, and the adults laughed, and the kids had no idea what I was talking about. So, anyhow, let's go ahead and get started. Now, okay, so like you guys have, for those who have been listening for some time, you guys know how I approach the text. For those of you who haven't listened to us before, or to us, speaking third person, whatever, we take a non-stenographic revelation approach to the text, which means we don't believe that all the text was written by God through man's hand. Not that it's not important. It's just that we don't, I don't believe that that's how it was transferred. And today's discussion is going to have a lot of that in it, because there's relatively straightforward, some would say evidence, some would say examples, who knows how you want to say it, that there are several stories that are tied together here in the first 6 chapters of the book of Bereshit, or Genesis. And it starts off by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the Shokin, Everett Fox's translation. And at the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on to say that the earth was wild and waste, and darkness over the face of the ocean, rushing spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was setting and dawning one day. And then let there be a dome amid the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And he made the dome and separated the waters from below the dome from the waters above the dome, and it was so. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this off with both feet in first, okay? So there's a couple things in this story which don't add up, and there's some things in the story which we just take for granted as if they were, spoken by God directly. And nothing in this text says God told, Moses to write this, and Moses wrote it. It's just tradition that Genesis was written by Moses. And tradition is fine as long as we don't take tradition and turn it into fact, because tradition is tradition. If it's fact, it's fact. It's not tradition, it's fact, Tradition is tradition, fact is fact. Tradition is kind of like faith, in that tradition is something that you use or feel about a text, especially in this particular example, that you feel the text is has a certain level of divinity associated with it, and that opinion is an opinion based upon the traditional view of the text, and not based upon anything within the text that says that Moses wrote this. There's nothing in the text that says that. There's only the book of Deuteronomy that has any such accreditation that Moses wrote this, and that Moses took it and placed it in the ark and that it was what was given to the kings to write and so forth. But when it comes to Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, it doesn't have any such accreditation. It's just a tradition that people believe by faith, not by fact, that Moses wrote this. So a couple of things that stand out in this is, number one, it never says that God created the earth. And it never says that God created the waters. It just says that God it says, at the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth. Now, in some other translations, it says it differently. Which translation is right is an argument that most people will, carry to their grave, that, that the King James is more correct than, Everett Fox, or that the JPS is more correct than, whatever, fill in the blank. But ultimately, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and in the actual Hebrew text, it comes out in the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth. But it never actually identifies that the earth itself was created by God. It just says that at the beginning of this creation event, the earth is there, the water is there. But we never identify where that is, nor is there any identification of how the heaven was divided and what heaven meant. Because it says right here, let there be a dome amid the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made a dome. This word is firmament. This word is we'll come back to this because this is one of the other issues. And it says that he separated the waters from below the dome from the waters above the dome. Well, now we have an assumptive step here, which we don't have any text for, and that is that there was outer space and inner space. Inner space being what we breathe, the air, and outer space being the vacuum that exists between planetary objects, orbiting objects and floating objects. So there's the reason I'm bringing this up. Oh, and by the way, let's go back to the dome. And then the dome idea is an idea that flat earthers love because this was, kind of the understanding that was had in the story. From the way the story is written, it seems to be they have an understanding of it being flat. It doesn't say flat. It says a dome. So a dome above a globe isn't a dome. It's a sphere. So why would they say dome unless they had some type of expectation or at least a lack of understanding of the spherical nature of our planet? I am not a flat earther by any stretch. To me, it doesn't make any sense that every single celestial body that we can see and that we can, that you and I can see from our telescopes and so forth, every single planetary body we see is spherical, except for floating rocks, which have no sustainable oxygen, gravity, water, or anything else. But every planetary body that we see in the sun, from the sun to Venus, Mercury, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and even little old Pluto, which by the way might become a planet again soon, like it was ever not a planet. But all of these bodies are round; they're spherical. Every single one of the moons that we see have some type of spheroid shape to them. Not all of them, because obviously if you look at Mars, Mars has two dark, very, very dark moons, and they have a less than spherical shape, but none of them are flat. This is not a pancake sitting on top of a tortoise sitting on top of a tree that's sitting on top of a snake. This is, everything out there is round. It is safe to assume that when we see the eclipse that the Earth shines upon the moon, that we're round. And when we go through and look at just basic topographical measurements throughout, not topographical, but longitudinal measurements from one longitude to another or latitude to another latitude, we see that there is clearly an understanding of a curvature of the Earth. So I don't want to get into flat Earth because People want to believe what they want to believe, and it's fine. But there's a reference here that now there's an outer space and an inner space, and there's waters above the inner space, and that the waters are separated from our inner space, or this air, oxygen environment that we live in, by this dome. Is it an actual dome? Well, if you look at some of the Jewish sages, back maybe even 1,000 years ago, you'll see that that they actually thought this was some type of a structure as well that was holding up the waters above the earth. It is also understood that this is what collapsed. Windows of heaven opened, and all the waters, are poured out onto the earth when we get to, later on in the time. I don't believe, this is just the way I view the text, I don't believe that this is a story that God wrote and that all of it is meant to be taken at face value. I believe it's a story that has been used to explain at some point in civilization, some point in society, that there was a story that explained what happened before, because they found things, they saw things that were there before them, and they couldn't explain it, so these are the stories they used to explain it. Is that the case? Who knows? You can't prove that it isn't. I can't prove that it is any more than we can prove that that this is supposedly an accurate rendition of what happened. What we can say is that within this story, there's no clear identification of where the water comes from. The waters were already there, just part of the earth. That's an assumption. And again, in the Hebrew, it doesn't say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It says in the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on to say that the earth was wild and waste and darkness over the face of the ocean or the sea or the water, and the rushing Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. Christianity has taken these things and has basically run with them, and starting to identify separations between God and the Spirit of God, and then the Melachim, or the angels that are sent from God, and then they build this entire monarchy of God, and it starts here, primarily because there's an individual identification of God working in, I'm not able to highlight, there I am, working individual or independent of God in his, wherever he lives, and God working within wherever we are. Moving on, we don't want to get bogged down there too deep, but God made the dome that separated the waters from below and above, and then God called the dome heaven. Okay, now the dome is the word firmament, and that word firmament in English, or I think Latin is its based on, identifies it as a shell, a hard, non-porous barrier, and it says that the dome itself was called heaven. So this is something that oftentimes is misunderstood, because they say, well, now the dome is a firmament that is holding up the water. Well, it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that this dome is actually our atmosphere, because heaven is what it's called, and it calls this area, this oxygen environment that we live in, it is called heaven throughout not only this story, but many stories throughout the combined text. So this dome isn't a hard shell, as some have said, but it's actually just the environment that we can breathe in. And that environment created, apparently, a separation between the waters above and the waters below. But we don't have any understanding of what this waters above and water below was. We just don't know, because we have no scientific understanding of that. Now, you guys know I try to maintain a scientific context when I'm viewing the text, because, hey, at some point you've got to take science into the equation. One of the things that you need to take into the equation is that you've got, we have this thing called the Younger Dryas. Younger Dryas is an example of now this is a hypothetical, a hypothetical event that happened back roughly 12,000 years or so BCE, and what we're looking at is really an event that science can see within the Earth itself, that we can track within recent history, what science would call recent history. And relatively speaking, and we're only talking 12,000 years, so we're talking about something that we can not only do carbon-14 dating, which can be affected by the speed of light, and there are things about that can be discussed, but they know that 12,000 years BCE, that there was an extinction event of most of the megafauna in North America. And this is called the Clovis event. It was the end of the Clovis civilization. The Clovis civilization wasn't, even though there's Clovis, New Mexico, which is really where a lot of this is started, but the Clovis event is actually a societal moniker or label that identifies a group of people who lived before this time. And at this time, 12,000 years BCE roughly, this entire civilization, which pretty much covered all of North America, and as well, there are some references to the Clovis event in other parts of the world, other continents. So it could be that the Clovis people or the Clovis culture was more widespread than just the North American continent. However, now keep in mind, this is a hypothesis, and there's people who argue against it, and there's people who argue for it. I'm not saying yay or nay for this being a meteor impact or a comet impact. I'm not talking about that at all. What I'm talking about is we have very strong information that identifies 12,000 years ago there was a massive event which caused, or the hypothesis is, that caused 1,200 years worth of ice age that happened at the end of the last glacial event. The last glacial event was pretty much north of Tennessee all the way up into the Great Lakes, primarily the Great Lakes and northward. And one of the arguments that they have within the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is that that the impact of this massive celestial body actually created several lakes in, I want to say, Illinois. I can't remember where one of them is, but the other ones are in the Carolinas, the bays, the Carolina Bay structure down along the coastline. They're saying that all of these point up to this area, and these are things. So what I'm saying is that we know from science that 12,000 years ago, or roughly, that there was a massive event that happened that created a carbon burnt foliage event that layered most of North America, or much of North America. And, so they know that. So 12,000 years ago, we have a mat of charcoal, burnt biomass that that we can identify at this age. So if you look back at the text, and we're reading this text, and we're seeing, God created all this thing, and then we get to the dating of when people were born and when they died and how long they lived for, and then we go back 6,000 years from today, or close to 7,000 years from today, and we say that's Eden. But that's all assumption or presumption on our part, because we're basing it on what? We're basing it on the lives and death, the record of life and death of these people. That's the only reason we're basing this whole young earth creation ideology is based upon people's birth and death, and then adding up those numbers and coming up with a relatively stable number from that information. But that information is based upon text that we've already decided has some issues with maintaining clarity of detail in the minutia. We talked about it recently, talking about the 600,000 armed people who left Egypt, as Israel, and how that there's a word that's used that was translated as thousands, but it's probably needs to be translated as troops instead of thousands, and that would reduce the number from being 2-point-some-odd million, if not more, plus animals and everything else. So you're talking about anywhere between 4 and 6 million feet walking on the desert, down to something in the more manageable size of 10 to 15,000 animals and everything else, which doesn't sound nearly as awe-inspiring as 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million. But we're not worried about awe-inspiring. We're trying to understand what the text says, and we're trying to differentiate what the text says from what tradition says about the text. So, is the earth 6,000 plus years old? Yes, but not plus another 1,000. It's probably plus a lot more than that, because we do know that there are very strong archaeological record, both anthropomorphic, as well as naturally occurring, that we can identify with very solid dates way past what tradition says the beginning of the heavens and the earth was. Now, keep in mind, when we read the story about God dealing with Israel and God bringing Israel out of Egypt, at no point does God say, remember the creation, that I created heavens and earth in 5 or 6 literal days, and that was all at this time 3,000 years ago from the time that they were in, roughly, who knows. He never says that. He says, remember I brought you out of Egypt. Remember what I did for you as I brought you out of Egypt. He never says, remember the creation. It's referred to once or twice that he is the creator, but it doesn't really identify that this story here is meant to be taken as the gospel. Okay? So, number one, I do not view this information as important for any information for dealing with God. It's just history that man has carried down to try to explain what happened. Did God create in this order? Very possible. But, then again, what do we do with day 1, and there's a day 2, there's a light, and because there's a setting and the dawning, okay, day 1, setting and dawning, day 2, setting and dawning, day 4, sun. What setting and dawning? How are you setting? How is something setting in the evening and dawning in the morning, and there's no sun? So keep in mind, what's here, I do not believe is meant to be taken as gospel. I believe it's just the history that man carried for generation after generation, and there's a seed of truth in there, but I do not expect every single word to be verbally and plenarily inspired or stenographically recorded. I just don't believe that's the case, because it doesn't make sense if that were the case. So then, again, we have the settings and the dawnings, so there's something happening in the sky, and now there's plants sprouting up, and how do you do that without a sun? And then we have separated the day from night, the lights in the dome, signs, days, season, lights in the dome, 2 greater lights ruling in the... Okay, so now we have what time? Now we have the sun and the moon and the stars. So if the sun and the moon and the stars came on day 4, what is setting and dawning the rest of the time? So again, this is not meant to be... I thought I'd turned all those off. It is not meant to be a stenographic recording of what actually happened. I don't believe that at all. Now, moving on. When we get to chapter 2, starting around verse 4, we see that it begins the whole process over again, basically from day 3, or the plants. No bush of the field was yet on the earth, no plant of the field had yet sprung up, for Jehovah God had not made it rain upon the earth, and there was no human Adam to till the soil. But a surge would well up from the ground and water the soil. And Jehovah God formed the human. So this is a retelling of the story we just read. It starts here in chapter 2, verse 4. And it just kind of retells the story. But it tells it from a different perspective. I believe this is a second story that has been sewn into the narrative. And it, for how many hundreds or thousands of years, it has been maintained as being, a cohesive record of the events. But in reality, it's very clear that chapter 2, verse 4 begins a retelling and doesn't focus on almost nothing of what was going on before. I have another way to fix this. How's that? Still hear it, but it'll be farther away. So anyhow, it goes on to say that Yoval caused to spring up from the soil every type of tree, desirable to look at and good and so forth. Where? In the garden in Eden. It's a garden in Eden. It's the Garden of Eden. Eden is a land, is an area that was called Eden or Adan in that day, and in this land there was a garden that was planted, and it's in the east of the land of Eden, and that's where he placed the human. Okay, now we've already seen that there's discontinuity in the text concerning how things were created, and we've already expressed my opinion that it is not meant to be a stenographic record of the events of creation. So now we have that God formed human of the dust of the soil and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. Now, since we've already had a reason to reclassify the text as being, not intended to be divine, then what is he talking about here? Is this the only human alive? Well, we know because we have evidence that there was human activity on this earth before 6,000 years ago. We know that. And for young earth creationists, when they stand before, people who actually have a science background and have studied fact within the archaeological record, not even carbon-14 dating. You dig 300 feet down, you're so far back in the past that, you without even doing carbon-14, you can base it upon strata and say, okay, we see our civilization here. We go down, we see, the Native American civilization here. Before that, we see, this civilization there, and we can go back and back and back and back and back. And we finally get back to the Clovis civilization. And, it's a lot longer back than 6,000 years. So what happened? Is Adam the only human? Again, I believe that these stories were told over and over and over again from generation to generation to generation, adding to the stories as they needed to, not to these stories per se, but adding other stories, for example, the flood or the Tower of Babel. And these stories were added, and then by the days of Abraham, these are the stories that were told. And then sometime after that, and being written down at some point, they were all gathered together and collected together, maybe as late as King Hoseiah's day or maybe King Hezekiah's day, maybe even earlier, but it could be later, and written down and then formed into a library, and that's what we're looking at here as a single book called Genesis. But I believe at one point it was really nothing more than a library of the collected stories. So if that's the case, that it is merely a library and not a stenographic representation of what happened, then we're not dealing with God formed human out of the dust on the sixth day, 6,800 and some odd years ago. Again, we have evidence that shows that humanity was around longer than that. So what do we do with this information? Well, depending on who you go with, there's some people who will say that there's something called the red shift theory, and that means that, and what they're describing there is that light has slowed, that light has slowed down quite drastically over the last 6,000 years, and that from our perspective, it's a lot longer than 6,000 years, but in their perspective, things were moving. I don't want to get into it because then we start getting into some pretty crazy stuff. But that's one of the ideas. The other idea is that Adam wasn't formed from the dust of the earth as the first human, but Adam was pulled from humanity and then placed in the garden, which to me, that actually kind of makes sense. Because he was made from the dust of the soil, or again, if this is euphemistic or somehow or another, I got beeps going up everywhere. If this is somewhat euphemistic or something, then he was taken from the people. And he did do something special for him. Breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Maybe there was something special that he was given when he was put into the garden. But keep in mind, this story really does mirror Israel's life. Because especially if you look at it like that he wasn't just created there on that day, but he was taken from a group of people and given a special place as a mechanism to demonstrate to the rest of humanity that there is a God and that God does have a desire for you to understand something. And that something is that, if you can live by these rules, then you can participate in the blessings that come from this place. And this place here was the garden. When we look at the promise of Israel in the future, it is that Israel will become a garden in the midst of the earth, and the whole earth would benefit from it. The only difference is that everyone at that time will know God. In this day, if this was a pre-Israel example of God interacting with man, then this is just one of those examples that God was trying to explain to humanity who didn't know God that there is a God and he has an interest, and this is how you can benefit from God's interest. Israel seems to be the same thing. He took Israel from the midst of the earth, from the midst of the world, and then made them a nation equal to all other nations. That could be exactly what's happening here with Adam. That Adam was taken from humanity and placed in the garden with Eve, and that he was given a place to live, and this place was no toil, no work, no fear, no war, absolute joy, paradise. And it says, and Jehovah God took the human and set him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch it. And God commanded the human, saying, from every other tree you can eat, but from this tree don't eat. So the only thing they were given is don't eat from this tree. Now, the tree is identified as the tree of knowing of good and evil. Now, that terminology has basically stuck with us from the beginning of us getting these texts, and we think of it as some kind of magical tree. It may very well have been. But its title, the knowledge of good and evil, is the only thing we know it as. What it was and what it was intended to represent, we don't know. All we know is this tree don't eat. Now, there's another tree in there that they could eat that was specifically identified, and that is the tree of life, or the tree that gives life. And they could eat of that. This is the only tree they couldn't eat, the tree of knowing good and evil. They could not eat of it. But every other tree they could. So that, to me, ideas that Christianity has, that Adam and Eve were created immortal. Well, if Adam and Eve were created immortal, then why is there a tree of life in the garden? And why is it that, and we'll get to it in a second, whenever they get kicked out of the garden, they are kept from getting back to the tree of life so that they don't live forever or live onward? So when we get to the story of Israel and the restoration of Israel, there's a promise that all the world who come to bring their fealty to God, that they will, and live according to his ways, that they'll receive this basically life-giving plants, life-giving trees, fruit that will grow without toil, and that there will be no need for war, no need for strife, and no need for anything of that paradise is going to be restored. And that seems to be the storyline that comes from Israel being brought from Egypt and set up in the land, is that if they were to obey, then God would bless them in their kneading bowl, and their threshing floor, and their this, and their that, and the fruit of their womb, and the fecundity of their sheep, and all these things that they're blessed in, and that there'll be no war, and the people around them will not be enemies, and so forth, and that this is the promise. So it seems to be that's the same thing that's going on here in this story, that it's all you have is one thing: don't eat this tree, and you can live here without fear of all the other humans, without fear of all the other of war or theft or death or anything else, because you've got this tree of life here. And you have all these things that are growing. All you have to do is tend it. It says to work it and watch it. Now, the reason we say that he didn't have to toil is because one of the penalties for them actually eating of this fruit is that they would then toil for their food. So God formed from the soil every living thing. Again, that doesn't seem to fit with archaeology, that all happened in that day, but it does seem, again, the root of the matter is that God placed a human and then a female human, male human, female human, in this garden, in a land that was called Eden. By the way, who called it Eden? Well, God called it Eden. You know, God generally doesn't do that. I mean, obviously, he named Haron. I mean, he named Abram to Abraham, and he named Sarah to Sarah. You know, there are some namings that goes on. He named, you know, Jacob Israel, but you know, when we talk about at the very beginning, why would you name this land if the only people there are this guy and this girl that you just made and put into the garden in the midst of this land? Why would you name it? And is the land a bordered land, or is it the entire continent, or is it the entire earth? Why would it be just a bordered land unless there were other people there with other borders? So there's lots of questions about that. Ultimately, though, they're told, the story is that they don't eat of that tree and you can live here. Obey and you can stay. The exact same storyline that we get with Israel in the land. Now in chapter 3, we start another story that is again sewn into the narrative. It ends in chapter 2, says, now the two of them, the human, Adam, and his wife, Havah, were nude, yet they were not ashamed. Why is that there? Because it's going to be needed later on in the story. So this information was added so that later on it makes sense. But then the next chapter, brand new story. The snake was more shrewd than all living things of the field that Jehovah God had made. And it said to the woman, even though God had said, you are not to eat of any, he said, are you not to eat of any trees of the garden? And the woman said to the snake, from the fruit of the other trees we can eat. But from the fruit of this tree in the midst of the garden, God says, you are not to eat of it. You can't touch it either, lest you die. And the snake said, die? You will not die. Rather, God knows that in that day you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will become like gods, knowing good and evil. Man, the Christians just love to take that section there, that you will become as gods, knowing good and evil, and they make it into all kinds of things. But again, talking snakes? We do have a talking donkey later on, but the talking donkey was specifically allowed to talk by God. It didn't talk. It was allowed to talk by God. So in order for us to be, maintain some consistency, God has to let this snake talk. But why is it that the snake gets punished if the snake is actually Satan? Because Christians will take this and turn it into the snake is Satan, that he was possessed by Satan, and that and he convinced Eve to mess up so that he could mess with God's plan of salvation. Well, where's Satan? Is there any text anywhere in here that we've read up to this point that identifies anyone other than God, his spirit, Adam and Eve, and the possible hinting towards there being more humans there? Because where did Cain get his daughters from, right? So so what's going on? Is this Satan? Do snakes talk? No, snakes don't talk. Donkeys don't talk. God opened its mouth, but that's the only time we ever hear about that happening. Snakes don't talk. So who's talking here? Well, the human called his wife's name Havah, life giver, for she became the mother of all living. And God made them coats of skins to clothe them. So people say, well, no, Cain wasn't born until after they were out of the garden. In the garden, she was called the mother of all life, the mother of all the living. Well, she didn't give birth to the animals. God made them. So she's not the life giver to the animals. God is. So who is she the life giver of? In the garden, she's called the life giver. Chapter 4 begins a new story that is tied into, again, an existing story or another story, and they sewed them together. Now, people will say, well, that then, after they left the garden, Adam knew Havah, and she became pregnant and bore Cain. And she says, Kaniti, I have gotten a man as has Jehovah. Well, let's back up a second. If this is here on purpose, and if this verse here, that she is called life giver because she has become the mother of all living, if that's here before the clothes of skin that they're given, then is it that awkward to think that the serpent speaking isn't a snake, but just a duplicitous human? Well, Jeff, there's no other humans other than Adam and Eve. Then why is she called a life giver right here? Again, these are stories that are sewn together. We see clear identifications between one story and the next story. And if in this story it says that she is a life giver before they leave the garden, then why is it not easier for us to assume that this is Cain talking? Later on in the Tanakh, the term Nahash or Nahashtim is identified as humans in a lot of places. People who were duplicitous, people who were shrewd. Well, Jeff, it says more shrewd than all the other animals. Again, and if it doesn't say anything about Satan here. It says that this entity, whatever this entity was, snake or Cain or whoever, whatever it was, spoke and reasoned on their own. So why then does God curse the snake if Satan was the one who was guilty? And why does God curse the snake to go on its belly and eat dust? Snakes don't eat dust. Well, Jeff, snakes used to have legs. That's a theory because they have spurs that are down near the base of the tail, right near their exhaust port. And there's two spurs there, and scientists believe that they are remnants of a pre-existent limb or two. But that's only a theory. We've never seen one. So, again, why is it so hard to believe that this is not Cain? Because it has to be a snake so that Satan can be involved, but we don't know who Satan is at this point. And snakes don't talk. And snakes don't eat dust. Well, Jeff, that's metaphoric. Well, then all of it's metaphoric. And if it's metaphoric, what is he trying to say? I believe it is metaphoric, and it's trying to say that Cain talked Eve into eating of the tree. And once that happened, Cain was given, or the Nahushtim, or Nahushtot, was given a specific curse. What's that curse? That he will eat dust. Okay, we'll come back to the next thing here in a second. Eat dust. Now, what happens in the days of Cain? Damned be you from the soil which opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you wish to work the soil, it will henceforth not give its strength to you. Wavering and wandering, you must be on the earth, on the dust, on the soil. You drive me away today from the face of the land that he was in, and from your face I must conceal myself, and I must be wavering and wandering on the earth. Now it shall be whoever comes upon me will kill me. So it seems to be Cain's penalty and the serpent's penalty are that they are going to go about eating dust. But snakes don't eat dust. Humans don't eat dust. Well, actually, you never had a mud pie, have you? Anyhow, it seems to be that it's an issue of the land is not going to provide for you, and that the land itself will only bring forth dust for you. You think about the Dust Bowl, same idea. That it's not going to be productive for you. So, chapter 4 seems to have a storyline, even though it's about Cain killing Abel, but his penalty is the same penalty that's given to the serpent within reason. Keep in mind, these are two different stories, so the verbiage might be different because they're two different stories. But the idea is that they're not going to be able to eat the fat of the land. They're going to be eating the waste of the land. That seems to be what they're trying to say. Because that's also Adam's punishment as well. Except Adam he will get food from the land. And that food from the land is going to take work, painstaking labor. Thorn and stinging shrub will spring up for you when you seek out to eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the dust from where you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So it seems to be the term dust for the serpent, the term dust for Adam, and the term dust for Cain all have a similar outcome: death, lack of sustenance. So the serpent, Cain, is given a very similar penalty as the serpent and Cain, and the only difference between them and Adam is that Adam will be able to bring forth sustenance from the ground, but it will be through much toil. Then there's a thing with the woman. She'll be trouble in childbirth and so forth like that. But ultimately, the issue is that I'm trying to define is that the serpent is not a serpent. The serpent is more than likely Cain. People talk. Humans can express themselves vocally through their mouth and through their vocal cords. And in doing so, because of the way the text is written, it seems very clear that Adam and Eve had Cain before, at least the way the texts are written, before they left the garden. Let's see. Now, Yehovah God made Adam and his wife coats of skins and clothed them. Again, another very strong Christian argument is that God killed two innocent animals, spilled their blood, and you owe God that innocent blood. You know, the original sin kind of thing. Well, it doesn't say anywhere that God killed two animals. It says God made Adam and his wife coverings or cloaks or coats or aprons or whatever of skins and clothed them. So what skins? Don't know. Now, I believe that this is skin. And it's possible that this is what we're talking about. But it's also possible that he made them something else. But it doesn't say anywhere that anything died for it. It doesn't say that at all. So why would someone assume that God killed two animals? Well, for the same reason they would assume that the tree of knowing of good and evil was an apple. Anyhow. So here, God said, here the human has become like one of us. One of us? KSOS. One of us. One of us. One of us. Who's us? Well, there's three in heaven. Jeff, don't you know that? God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And these three are one. Written by some monk who added it to the text about 250, 300 years ago. To a part of the book that has no bearing on the rest of it anyway. What is going on here? Become like one of us, knowing good and evil. We don't know. There's no information whatsoever that identifies what this means. All we do know is that he can go back in and eat from the tree of life and live throughout the ages. So, was he immortal before? Was he mortal afterwards? I don't know. It says here, after they had already sinned and after they were being removed from the land, it says we need to keep them from getting back to this tree so they can't eat of it and live. So it definitely seems to be that the tree of life gave life, and that the reason it was placed in the garden, the only thing that makes sense to me is that it was placed in the garden to give them life. And they were being removed from that, which takes us back to, in that day you shall surely die. Did Adam and Eve die in that day? Oh, no, Jeff, but a day is 1,000 years, you know, so they died within 1,000 years. Day is 1,000 years came about much later, referenced briefly in Psalms, but is never identified in the text as being a timetable. None at all. But if they had access to the tree of life before this event, and they were removed from the tree of life after this event, they have begun the process of death, where before they could sublimate that or subsidize their mortality with the tree of life and not die. But now they are cut off from the tree of life. Death begins. Doesn't that make a little bit more sense than saying that we're immortal before and mortal after? And doesn't it make a lot more sense than saying that they died within 1,000 years, and that means that they died that day? Anyhow, so God sent them away from the garden in Eden to work the soil from which he had been taken. And he drove human out and caused him to dwell eastward of the Garden of Eden. Okay, Eden here. The garden within Eden on the east side of it. And then he sent them eastward of the Garden of Eden. So where are they at? Well, they're either on the border of Eden and whatever else is there, or they're outside of Eden altogether. Don't know. But they were removed from the garden and they were sent eastward. Now, the cherubim were placed there. Now, this is something I don't want to get into detail. I can just tell you that there's a lot of argument within the linguistic community that this particular verse says that God stood, or God rested between the cherubim with the ever-turning sword, flaming sword, to watch over the way to the tree of life. So, what does this mean to us? Well, God walked in the garden and said what? Adam, where are you? Is he omnipresent or omniscient or not? Adam, where are you? And then he sits between the cherubim at the entrance to the tree of life. So again, these terms. Again, this is not meant to be a stenographic representation of what happened. It's not meant to be a divine text from God telling you what he wanted you to know, at least not the way I view it. But these texts definitely don't identify God as being omnipotent or omnipresent. Anyhow, moving on. So we have Cain and Abel. Cain said, Yehovah said to Cain, well, let me back up a second. It was after the passing of days that Cain brought from the fruit of the ground a gift to Yehovah, as did Havel. And he too brought from the firstborn of his flock, from their fat parts. And Yehovah had regard for Havel and his gift. For Cain and his gift he had no regard. Cain became exceeding upset, and his face fell. So what are we having here? We have an offering. We don't know why. There's no identification of sin. Therefore, the text does not say this is a sin offering. There's no indication of sin whatsoever. Well, Jeff, this has to do with them leaving the garden, and this is their sin offering for leaving the garden. God didn't say they needed one. Oh, but Jeff, it's in the Torah. The Torah wasn't given to Adam and Eve. They were told not to eat of this tree. That was it. They don't have 613 commands. They did not worship the Sabbath or set aside the Sabbath. There's no indication in the text whatsoever. It's tradition. It's faith claim that people say that they did, but there's nothing in the text to support that. But Yehovah said to Cain, why are you so upset? Why has your face fallen? So it says, for Cain and his gift, he had no regard. Now, I use Christianity a lot because I spent quite a lot of my life wandering from my father's faith, and spent that time in Christianity, and I know it real well, cover to cover, basically. And if the Torah was given to Adam, then why is Cain having to be told not to kill? So the second commandment ever given in the text is, well, the first one is don't eat that tree. The second one is don't kill. Not 613, is it? So we move on. Why are you upset? Why is your face fallen? Is it not thus? If you intend good, bear it aloft. But if you do not intend good, at the entrance is sin, a crouching demon, towards you his lust, but you can rule over him. What does that mean? Huh? Well, it's very poetic. At the entrance, sin, a crouching demon or a lion, a door, towards you is his desire or lust, but you can rule over him. That's all that matters to me. You can rule over him. We were born in sin, Jeff. We're born in sin. We can't rule over sin because sin rules over us. No, it says right there. But you can rule over it. Oh, okay. So anyhow, Cain said to his brother Havel. Now this is interesting in verse 8. We don't know what he said to him. Then we have a a commentary that says, "But then it was when they were out in the field that Cain rose up against Havel, his brother, and killed him." Yehovah comes to Cain and says, "Where's Havel, your brother?" And he says, "I don't know. Am I the watcher of my brother?" And then God responds and says, you killed him. You killed him. And you created a damnation in the soil. You created an abomination in the soil, and the soil will not bring forth its fruit for you. I believe that this is what is implied when we get to the flood story, that they had corrupted the soil, the land, the arets, the adamah, with innocent blood being spilt, and the earth would not bring forth its sustenance or its power for them, and it needed to be washed and atoned for by those who slayed the blood, spilt the blood. But again, that's all just speculation anyway. So one more thing here, and that is no. Okay. Now let's go to the next one. So Cain goes out and he brings wives unto himself, and she gets pregnant, and she brings forth Hanok, Cain, the builder of city. Well, where did Cain get his wife? Don't know. But if Adam was brought out of an existing population and set in this land, then Cain got his wife from them. Well, you guys remember back in here where it says, let's see, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and they will bruise you in the head, and you will bruise them in the heel. Well, Jeff, that's Jesus and Satan. No, this is Cain and Abel, or Cain and Seth, Cain and somebody. Why do you say that, Jeff? Snakes don't talk. So, who is being enmity between whom? Well, if you look at what's going on in the flood, the story seems to be that Seth's lineage survives and Cain's lineage dies. So it seems to be that Genesis 3:15 was prognosticative of the flood story. Anyhow, moving on. So, let's see, skipping all that. Now, this is the record of the begettings of Adam, humankind, at the time of God's creating humankind. So this is the beginning of another story that's been added to the context. Adam lived 130 and lived 30 and 100 years and begot sons in his likeness and blah 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 blah, all the way down, and this is where we get our date line from. And then we see Lamech and Methuselah and all these things. Then it says, now it was when humans first became many on the face of the soil, and women were born to them, that the divine beings. Now, I don't understand why Everett Fox translated it like that, knowing that there's such a power-mad, vamped, crazed group of people believe that these divine beings were the sons of God. They were angels, Jeff. Wait a minute, time out. Angels. What you talking about, Willis? We've heard of cherubim up to this point. We've heard of the Spirit of God, but we haven't heard anything about angels. Have you guys seen any angels on here anywhere? Let's see. Oh, goodness. Oh, well, Jeff, don't you know that the book of Enoch says that Enoch lived for 180 years, and he begot sons and daughters, and then he died. Wait a minute. Then he died. Wait a minute. Other versions don't say that. And he was not, for God took him. Right? And he goes and speaks to the angels and teaches them about, so that they don't go and hook up with the women. There's nothing in the text to support that. You have to go to a text that was written. The book of Enoch was written during the Second Commonwealth. A lot of information in the book, especially the writing style and the words used, place it definitely in the Hellenistic period of Israel and the land, post-exile. And, that's the first time we get to it. which, by the way, it's the book of Job and after, which is still a Second Commonwealth book, where you see angels prolific in this. You see messengers before that. But now we have heavenly hosts of angels in Psalms, late Psalms, and, you know, in these later books, but not in these stories. So we're saying that the very first example of angels is right here in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2. That is our indication, our understanding, our information from God that there are angels out there that can do us harm. Nah, I don't buy it. At this point, I view things like this. You've got this giant ocean. This is how I view it. This giant ocean that stretches infinitesimally, an infinitesimal distance that way, this way. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And then when God created, he, for example, in this example, brings up an island in the midst of this vast ocean with no end. And this island comes up in the middle of it. And then this is our creation. Christianity and others teach that there's another creation out there that's not mentioned in the Bible. This other creation is a place where God can be an individual sitting on a throne, and that all these angels can be represented by individuals singing and praising and playing music and all these other things that they're doing while they're gathering dust, waiting on something to be done down here on earth. But there's nothing in the text that identifies that. That's a tradition, a faith choice. But there's nothing in the text to support that. My understanding is there's this great big ocean, and then there's this island. Anything that comes onto the island came out of the ocean, and everything that goes back to the ocean is ocean. But outside of the island, there is no indication in the text that there's anything else out there. It's just a vast ocean of God. And this is the only creation that happened. So where are these angels at? In the way I view what I just described to you, it's impossible, because God would have had to send himself down to do this with these women. Nothing in the text supports that type of context. So who is out there? Well, remember, if Genesis 3:15 is prognosticating Seth and, or not necessarily Seth, but Cain and another lineage, a brother or something like that, if that's what it's defining, then it's not divine beings, it's Elohim. Well, that's exactly what it says. See, what verse are we in? Verse 2, okay. B'nai ha-Elohim. You guys see that? B'nai ha-Elohim. So, what does that mean? What does Elohim mean? The people who have 2 ounces of Hebrew gossip will say, well, it means God. No, it means a mighty one. Again, I don't know why Everett Fox chose this word, but it's not. That's not how I would have done it. But I'm not a linguistic professor at all. The Elohim just means powerful, mighty ones. We have no indication that there are any such thing as angels up to this point. None whatsoever. We have no indication that these people in this day even had any understanding of angels. It's a reverse engineering of the text which brings angels into it. So who are these Elohim? B'nai Elohim, sons of Elohim, sons of the mighty ones. Who are the mighty ones? Well, we kind of think in America that the mighty ones for us is George Washington, the founding fathers. That's a proper term, because any president is an Elohim. On this YouTube channel, I am the Elohim of this YouTube channel. I'm the one who owns it. I'm the one that has the power to add, subtract, bring in, remove from. That's all Elohim means. When it's applied to Yehovah, your Elohim, it's identifying Yehovah as your mighty one. But it's not saying that there are other mighty ones, and these other mighty ones are gods or angels. Moses was an Elohim before Pharaoh. He wasn't a god. He was just placed higher in power and authority than Pharaoh. In Genesis and Deuteronomy 28, it says, "And you will be removed from the land, and you will be sent out into the world, and you will serve other Elohim." There are no gods other than Yehovah. This is the only God that's spoken of. But when we see Elohim, we think, oh, well, that means other gods. Well, no, there's only one God. I am Yehovah. I am, beside me there is none other. Elohim, if it's not associated with Yehovah, is identifying a mighty one in our presence, a human being. So, who are these mighty ones? The B'nai, the children of the mighty ones that saw how the Adam and Havah were, because the human women, the word human, what is the word human here? You go back and you look. And the human knew Havah, his wife. Because we're looking at the same translation here. If you skip between translations, you have to do the same exercise in each one. And Yehovah called to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" And the human and his wife hid himself. So, why did you say, "and the humans hid themselves"? Because this word human is also synonymous with the term Adam. Let's see. We'll see it in this translation as well. Not good for the human to be alone. I don't have the ability to mark in this, unfortunately. Formed the human, blew into his nostrils, and the human became a living being. And he placed the human from whom he had formed, and we go on to see, he actually has it written out like that. Took the human, put him in the Garden of Eden. And I even saw it a little bit ago, and I just marked it in my head to come back to it. Oh, well. You can see what I'm saying here, that human is the identified term for, in this case, the human male. So when we get back down to Genesis 6, it says, and specifically Adam is identified as Adam in almost the entirety of the text up to this point. And it goes on to say, saw how beautiful the human women were. So Adam's daughters. That's all he's saying. So Seth's sons saw how beautiful Adam's daughters were. That's how I believe this was intended to be read. Again, no such thing as angels in the text to this point. These people in this day who wrote this did not have an understanding of angels in this context. That's just not, that nothing's been identified in the first 6 chapters that even gives angels a foothold in the story. So, let's rule out angels. So, Elohim means mighty ones. So, the B'nai Elohim, the sons of the mighty ones, who is that? Sons of mighty ones. Who saw the women of Adam. Who is alive that isn't part of Adam's lineage? Well, Cain, because he was cut off. That was the idea. He was cut off. He was removed. He was not allowed to live with Adam anymore. He wasn't allowed to live anywhere around the Eden any longer. He was sent out to roam the earth, where he found other people. So, these other people saw how beautiful the daughters of Adam were. That's all this means to me. Then we go on to see about the flood, and I'm going to go and finish out chapter 6. He goes on to say, this is how you make an ark, 300 cubits, make it of gopher wood, pitch it inside and cover it within and without with pitch, which is a tar. The end of all flesh is coming because the earth is filled with wrongdoing, and I'm about to bring ruin upon them along with the earth. So, it says 1,500 years after Adam is born, created, or gathered from the rest of humanity, whichever happened, then there was a giant flood. going back to the idea that we have the record of the Clovis peoples who died out suddenly 12,000 years or so BCE. We can also look and see in northern Siberia back in the early 1900s, there was a extended warm period which caused a lot of the ice in northern Siberia to thaw, and what they found was an entire area, just a giant area filled with mastodon tusks and mastodon skeletons, all together, all in perfect shape, not tossed about, not scattered through all, not broken up, but just animals that died relatively quickly where they were in the relative same place. And they collected tens of thousands of tusks, or thousands upon thousands of tusks, and there's pictures of it and all that and where it got from. Well, that was also something that happened between 10 and 12,000 years ago. If there's a tsunami that would create, that would have to be created, if planetary mechanics, any kind of, not even planetary, let's just talk E equals mc squared. You take a ball, you spin it. And then let's take that ball and let's add a whole lot of weight to it that wasn't there before. What's going to happen to the ball? Well, all this weight that comes down upon it is going to shift its center of balance. It's going to shift a lot of things. When that happens, it's going to cause great destruction over the entire Earth, pretty much like an entire a tsunami that can basically wash over an entire continent in just a few moments. I mean, because like the one that hit Indonesia just a week or so ago, it was 500 miles an hour, and it was just from an earthquake. It's a 7. It wasn't even a big earthquake. Well, 7.5 is big, but so these thousands upon thousands upon thousands of mastodon who were full skeletons sitting in one large, I want to say field, but it was a very large area. They would have been washed away. It wasn't a valley. It wasn't in a crevice. They would have been washed away, but instead they just died there. Why? Well, there's actually some of the things go back to the Clovis event and the, basically this 1,200 years of ice age that followed this supposed or hypothetical Younger Dryas event. That would have done it. I'm not saying it did, but that would have done it. But a catastrophic flood would have washed all of that ice away, because the flood would have happened 6,000 years after that, or maybe 8,000 years after these guys were in the ice, and would have washed all that ice away, because a tsunami does that. You see how many houses it washes away with just one wave? And all those bones and everything else would have been scattered instead of intact. Doesn't make sense. But there are things. Let me give you an example. There is record of a major climactic event that happened not long after what the flood story time would have been. Roughly between 2000 BCE to 2500 BCE is when the Bible equates the flood happening. Well, during this time, there was a massive event that happened in the area, which they believe was another comet or meteoroid event. And actually, I didn't see this, although I see it now. Who used the dates 2349, 2348 BCE for the biblical flood. I didn't see that. I just saw that. But this could be what was the beginning of the story that became the flood story. But it wasn't global. But Jeff, how do you handle fish that are in fossil form in the top of caves, hundreds and thousands, hundreds and hundreds of feet, meters or thousands of feet above sea level? I don't know. All I can tell you is that if water covered everything, then all humanity would have died throughout the entire earth, but we do not see that in the archaeological record. We see established civilizations before and after what time we see of the flood. But if the flood was a localized event and it was made into a global event just through the telling of it, Chinese telephone, then that would make more sense. So what was going on here? No idea. I don't know. What's the importance of the story? I don't know. It doesn't fit anything in the archaeological record. It doesn't fit anything within the models of science. Do you know how much water it would take to fill the earth up to the top of the highest mountains that we have today? It's an assumption that there were no mountains in that day. It's an assumption that we did not have great trenches to hold water in that day. Those are assumptions. Only assumptions. And it's okay to have assumptions. I have a lot of them. But don't build fact upon assumptions and use the assumptions as fact. So what happened here? What is this deluge that was brought upon the earth? And who died? I don't know. It's very likely that the Noah story is another example of the Adam story, which are both forerunners to the Israel story. God saved one group, one family of humanity in order to show humanity that God is involved with this creation. He is real. This is the reason. This is the proof kind of thing. But all we know for sure is that what the text says is that when Noah came off the boat, he knew what was clean and unclean in animals, and that means he must have had the Torah. Okay. We're going to stop there. We'll pick it up again next week. But there is a story saying that there was a flood. There is a story saying that there was the Garden of Eden. There is a story saying that God created everything in 6 literal days. In 6 days. Literal remains to be seen because what was the setting and the dawning before the sun was around? So how long were those days? There's a lot of questions. Again, when we get to the Torah, it doesn't say, I am God who created the heavens and the earth, who pulled Adam from the dust and pulled Noah from the flood and pulled Eber from the Tower of Babel. He says, I am the Yehovah your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you saw what I have done for you, and you have seen me work in your presence, and you don't have to be told by somebody else that there's a God. I've shown you that I am real. That's the only thing we can tell you from Torah. None of this information here is salvific in nature. It is just the stories that were given. Now, once we get to Abraham onward, I believe the stories become far more real and far more important in the detail. But at no point do I believe any of this that the minutia is divine. The minutia is just minutia. The seed of the story is what's important. So what happened here? There is a story from early humanity that identifies that there was a paradise that man had but lost, and that later humanity lost favor in the eyes of God, and God destroyed all of humanity but saved one family, and then from there it continues and continues and continues and continues. By the way, when we get to the story of the Tower of Babel, there is no human record within the archaeological data that shows that all humanity was gathered together in one place. But I think there's a value in the story. So anyhow, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So what I'm going to do right now is I'll give you guys a few minutes to get caught up, and I'll start looking back for the... okay, good. I'll let you guys get caught up so we can look for questions, and I'm going to get some water here in a few minutes for a few seconds. So if you guys will bear with me, I'm going to put you guys back on the welcome screen, and I'm going to mute my mic, and I'll be right back. Refreshing water. Okay, so any questions? I'm going to look in the chat room here while I'm doing this. Right, so your coat did not die for your sins. Exactly. Yes. Your sins did not kill an innocent animal. God is not supposed to be understood as being this this angry being that will destroy you with death and dismemberment and skin you, skin you to use you for something else. Just, that's a lot of that just has to do with people who have a very strong opinion of their traditional views and faith choices, and nothing else is important. It's unfortunate. It is what it is. Okay, so just a couple more moments for questions I'll give you guys, so I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm assuming that I've stunned everybody into a deep slumber or unassailable stupor. I'm not sure which. But I do want to give you guys an opportunity to ask if you have any questions, because if you're thinking of a question, I'm sure somebody else is as well. And if you guys didn't notice, there is somebody who wrote on the wall who was getting on my case because I was being a little bit, what do you want to call it, animated in my jest of Christianity's position on certain things. And I left it up. Why? Because, hey, it's a valid comment. So you guys, if you have comments, make the comments. I'm happy to talk about them. Be nice. You don't have to be mean. Not that he was mean or rude or anything like that, but you don't have to be mean or rude. Just be nice. I'm not trying to intentionally upset people or blind them with science. I just, hey, I'm human. I spent 30 years walking with Christians and believing that stuff. So I'm not just not some Jew who's just picking on Christians. I still got the stench on my clothes. I'll probably catch hell for that too. But you know what I'm saying. Okay, so I don't see any questions. So what I'll do is I'm going to say, who was left behind? I'm not sure what that question is. Who was left behind? Who was left behind? No, who is on first? Left field is I don't know, I think. And behind would be the umpire. So I don't know. I don't understand the question. I know it's going to take about 20, 30 seconds for you to get this on the voice and then respond back.